I was born as Narendranath Bhattacharya and adopted the name of M.N. Roy while in the United States of America, and I have no other aliases. The name of my father was Dinabandhu Bhattacharya. My mother's name was Basanta Kumari. I entered the United States as Martin. I came by sea and landed in San Francisco. I remember neither Martin's first name nor the date when I landed, but it was in spring of 1916. I left the United States in summer 1917, but do not remember the exact date either. I left by train for Mexico as M.N. Roy. Today we will be discussing the life and works of Manomendranath Roy, one of the leading thinkers of the pre-independence Indian political scenario. I just read out from an autobiographical statement of Manomendranath Roy. The man whom we know by the name of M.N. Roy was born as Narendranath Bhattacharya in 1887 in the Arbelia village of the then Chabbish Pargana district of United Bengal. He was born in a traditional Brahmin family, and his father was, to start with, a priest, though he later moved on to the profession of a school teacher. Narendranath had his early education in his own village of Arbelia. Then he moved along with his father and the family to Kodalia, then came down to Calcutta, and after his schooling enrolled himself as a student in the Bengal Institute of Technology under Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, but didn't complete his studies. In 1905, the partition of Bengal was done, and that started a surge of nationalist movements, at least in this part of India. And Manomendranath, though he is not known by that name, but we would be referring him as Manomendranath or M.N. Roy because that is usually his name. So Manomendranath, along with other young men of his time, was drawn towards the movement against partition, the precursor to a larger nationalist movement for independence of India. And he was also drawn towards the movement of what we later termed them as the extremists or the terrorists or the revolutionaries, who thought that freedom could come not by petitions or prayers, but through armed struggle against the colonizing Britishers. He became a member of the Anushilan Samiti and took part in activities which was deemed to be anti-Indian and put to jail. He later released from jail, and at that point of time it was thought that against the Britishers the Indians could fight only with outside assistance and help. And the best possible pole from which the Indian revolutionaries could seek assistance was Germany, since Germany was a traditional enemy of England, and since, as being colonial powers, both were at loggerheads with each other. So contracts were made with German forces for arms, money, and other kinds of help, and somehow Narendranath was chosen to be the person who would go out on a mission to seek such material help from the German forces. And he left by sea for Java in Indonesia, and thus started his moving about throughout the world, which in course of time would take him from Indonesia to Japan, from Japan to USA, from USA to Mexico, from Mexico to Soviet Union, from Soviet Union to Germany, and from Germany back to India. And by this time, almost 16 years have elapsed. And in this course of 16 years, he was not just journeying physically to seek assistance from other forces, forces inimical, forces antithetical to British colonialism, for freeing India from the clutches of the Britishers. It is also an intellectual journey. It is also a journey in which he traveled through the domain of philosophy, the domain of ideas, starting from individualism, then to nationalism, and then to communism, and came back to India as someone who was somewhat disillusioned with communism, or at least the organized part of it. To be slightly more specific on this point, and I would just quote from his writings, the quest for freedom can be referred back to man's struggle for existence. So freedom to him was that much essential for human existence. And he also made a subtle difference between freedom and independence. And freedom obviously meant something much, much more than independence. Because independence could be just political, while freedom touches all aspects of human life. In his early days, in his student days, while in India, like other young men and women of his time, who are literate at least, he has read the writings of Vivekananda and Bankim Chandra, and was drawn towards some idea of socialism through the writings of Bankim Chandra, and some ideas of nationalism through the writings of Vivekananda. When he reached San Francisco, he met his first wife there, Evelyn, and he and Evelyn traveled to New York City, where he lived with Lala Lajpat Rai, one of the leading luminaries of Indian freedom movement. And he had his first training in leftist ideology from Lala Lajpat Rai. At the same time, he studied extensively at the New York Public Library, reading works by Marx, Engels, and others. Since he has fled from India, since he had police cases against him in India, the Britishers were keeping a track of him. So he had to leave United States for the safe haven of Mexico. And that's when he adopted the name of Manomendranath Roy, or M.N. Roy. Why did he choose that name? He has never mentioned anywhere, but that's how he is known now, known to the posterity. In Mexico, he started a socialist movement, took part in it. He started writing in local newspapers. Incidentally, though not very much formally educated, M.N. Roy had a very good control over Spanish, French, and German languages apart from English. and he transformed the Socialist Party in Mexico into a Communist Party. So in that sense, he was one of the founders of Communist Party in Mexico. And there he came in touch with one of the leading figures of international communist movement of that time, a member of the Communist International, Borodin, Mikhail Borodin. And through Borodin, he came to be connected with Lenin. In fact, Lenin came to know of M.N. Roy through Borodin. And he was invited to the newly formed state of Soviet Union and invited to the Communist International, which he joined. Here, this young man, though still not much well versed in Marxism, came into contact with Lenin, and Lenin found his ideas to be interesting and worthwhile. In 1920, Lenin presented his ideas on anti-colonial movements going on in the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And how should the Soviet Communist Party, how should the Communist International deal with those independence movements going on in the colonies? And this is called Lenin's ideas on national self-determination. And in course of discussions, M.N. Roy did somewhat object to or given some alternative ideas to what Lenin thought about it, and Lenin asked him to prepare a supplementary thesis on this end point. And in the same session of the Communist International in 1920, both Lenin's thesis on national self-determination in the colonies and M.N. Roy's supplementary thesis on the same issue, both were presented, and both are adopted with minor or some modifications. And thus, M.N. Roy established himself in the hierarchy of organized communist movement in the platform of Communist International, and he started rising in ranks in the Communist International, and he became a member of the Presidium of the Communist International. And he became so much important, his ideas were so much sought after, that he was sent to China to assist, to advise the Chinese Communist Party how to achieve revolution in China. He was bringing to Chinese Communist Party advices and messages from the Communist International. He was given that important responsibility. Though he couldn't achieve much while in China, he came back, and by this time Lenin was not there anymore. The mantle of leadership has fallen on Joseph Stalin. He has become the leader of the Communist International, and for some ideological reasons, maybe ideological hair splitting, issues not so much debatable, but issues may be highly personal, somehow Roy fell in disfavor with the leaders of the Soviet leaders of the Communist International, including Joseph Stalin. So in 1929, he was expelled from Communist International, though M.N. Roy himself claimed that he had left Communist International voluntarily. From Soviet Union, he traveled to Germany, stayed there, and came back to India in 1930. And 1930 was a time when the freedom movement organized by the Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi, was on a full form. And M.N. Roy joined this nationalist movement And he had the dream, or he had the desire to radicalize the movement, to radicalize the congressmen, because he didn't have much faith on the middle class, Western educated leaders who were leading the independence movement in India. And he thought they're basically bourgeois in outlook. He thought they're limiting themselves to political independence, the demands of political independence, while much more important, much more basic was social and economic freedom for the millions of impoverished Indians. So that's where his ideas of communism came in. And he was trying to merge, he was trying to infuse his ideas of communism into the nationalist movement that was going on in India at that time. But he couldn't achieve much. He couldn't radicalize the congressmen, though they respected him, but they didn't buy his ideas. So out of that disappointment, out of that frustration, he formed his own political party, a Radical Democratic Party. Then came independence, and after independence, and here we can find a strange convergence of ideas of Gandhi and M.N. Roy, though he didn't have much respect for Gandhi. Gandhi, prior to his assassination, had suggested that since the independence had been won from the Britishers, there's no need to keep Congress as a political party any longer. It has served its purpose. And Congress should now be transformed into some kind of a social welfare organization, in Gandhi's language, as a Lok Sevak Sangh. To that extent, Gandhi was against political parties. Surprisingly, M.N. Roy, though ideologically trained to be a communist, and not by anyone, not just by reading books on communism, books on Marxism, but through everyday practical work along with rubbing shoulders with leaders like Lenin, Borodin, Kautsky, or Joseph Stalin. So he was into communism in full sense of the term, while Gandhi was not. And even M.N. Roy suggested that there's no need for the party he had founded, the Radical Democratic Party, to exist any longer. And he started believing that parties are not really democratic. In fact, parties act against the democratic aspirations of the people, and parties actually are mere power centers led by selfish leaders bent only on their acquisition of power or prestige or something else. And he suggested that the party he has founded, Radical Democratic Party, should be dissolved. And it was dissolved and transformed into a totally non-party academic or intellectual organization called Radical Humanist Association. And he was leading the association, writing for it, elaborating on his ideas of radical humanism while staying in Dehradun with his second wife, Eileen, when he fell sick, and he died in 1954. So this is the story of a man who has lived between 1887, the end of 19th century, lived up to the middle of 20th century, has seen the emergence of nationalist movement in India, has worked with the Communist International, had traveled throughout the world from east to west and had intellectually journeyed from individualism to communism and back to individualism to nationalism to communism and back to once again individualism. In 1948, or when he founded the Radical Humanist Association, he had by then become one of the leading critics of communism. Basically, his criticism against communism was that communism could be radical, but was not humanist. And it was not humanist in the sense that in the name of class, in the name of socialism, in the name of class unity or class solidarity, it was ignoring the individual. The individual was not given the freedom which the individual did fight for as part of the socialist struggle. When socialism came, the individuals denied this freedom. So in a communist structure, in a socialist state structure, individuals do not have any freedom. In a communist party structure, individual members do not have freedom, and this freedom M.N. Roy was yearning for, and that's why he turned against the ideology he had acquired a few decades back. His position of total opposition to communism did not mean that he has joined the bourgeois camp. Did not mean that he has bought the ideas politically of the Congress party in India, or has become a Gandhian in that sense. He tried to somehow bring about a synthesis between individual freedom and collective good. So it's always a very difficult tightrope walking between individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other hand. There is a chance that one can always fall from that high rope either into the abyss of individualism or into the abyss of collectivism. And Roy tried to keep his balance and walk the tightrope and find a middle way between the need of the individual and the interest of the collectivity. And that's why he formed his ideas on radical humanism after being known as, and he was really the founder of two different communist parties in the world. Perhaps no individual can claim this as distinction. He founded the Communist Party of Mexico, as well as in 1920 he founded the Communist Party of India outside India in Tashkent in the then Soviet Union. This is an emigre Communist Party. Later on, the Communist Party of India was formed in 1924 or 25 in India, but its beginning was in Tashkent, where it was founded by M.N. Roy and at least one more Bengali, Abani Mukherjee. So a person who has taught himself Marxism-Leninism through association with Lala Lajpat Rai, through reading extensively theoretical works of Marxism-Leninism in New York City Library, who had written extensively in 3 or 4 languages on ideas which are broadly Marxist, or who could dare challenge Lenin with a supplementary thesis, and whose thesis was adopted at the same time as the thesis of Lenin at the Communist International meeting, was given the most important responsibility of teaching how to carry on the revolution to the Chinese Communist Party, a responsibility given by the Communist International. And this man, M.N. Roy, came back to India, joined nationalist movement, and ultimately turned against communism and offered a totally different kind of philosophical take on the Indian situation. That makes him interesting. That makes a study of M.N. Roy interesting, because his life and his works rather, reflect the confusion of the Indian middle class, who lived, studied, worked, wrote and thought in the period around independence. And most of them, or at least those who were more perceptive, were bothered with the question of what is more important, freedom or independence. And this question Roy was trying to answer through his ideas on radical humanism. What is more important to an individual, freedom or independence? And we will look into Roy's philosophical ideas, his philosophical development, in the course of our next lecture.